Welcome back to another Djinn diary. Today, I found out that unemployment does not pay out for one full year, instead it is a set amount. The remaining balance of unemployment is 2 weeks, which I thought I still had 5 months to find a new job. While staring at the screen, my anxiety is shooting through the roof. Similar to a horror scene of when a person is trying to escape death and barely made it by a split second. The nightmare is snowballing and it doesn't feel like there is any escape route. It is spooky season, so I'll be sharing a lot of Halloween stories. Buckle up as I share my nightmare with you guys. I'm fairly certain I was almost caught in a sinister Halloween trap. This happened the day before Halloween, so a lot was going on in my area. Home decoration and kids just crawling all over the streets. After finishing work early, I decided to go for a run around 4:30 p.m. Normally, my routes cross a lot of streets full of people, so I opted for a quieter path along a canal towpath and through some woods, which I knew would be less busy. Everything was going well, and I was pacing myself until about 6 kilometers into my route when I reached a long, straight path. The path had a canal on the left and an abandoned wasteland on the right where factories used to stand. Some old factory remnants were still there, overgrown with trees and weeds, but mostly demolished. As I approached one of these factory sections, I noticed a rough-looking guy sitting on a wall with his legs hanging down. He jumped up as he saw me coming and shouted something I couldn't make out. When I reached his level, I heard him say, "Wait there, can you help me find my phone?" He said this as he ran down the fire escape steps. I stopped when I reached the bottom of the steps, so we were standing just a few feet apart, separated by an old iron fence with vertical bars and spikes on top, like something you'd see around a church. He repeated his request, saying he had dropped his phone nearby and asked if I could call his number to help him find it. Since my phone was strapped to my arm, I felt I couldn't refuse, so I took it off and unlocked it. He quickly rattled off a number, but it didn't start with 07, which made me uneasy. At this point, I was suspicious, but not overly worried. I'm in good shape, with a size and weight advantage over him, and there was still a fence between us. He looked unfit and possibly homeless. I thought if he intended to mug me, his only chance would be if he had a knife, so I kept a good distance from the fence and watched his hands closely. I told him I hadn't caught the number because he said it too fast. He then gave another number, this time starting with 07. I entered 7 digits when he started looking around and saying, "I can hear it, come help me look." Just as I was about to tell him I hadn't even finished dialing, a much larger man appeared from behind a nearby wall. He looked scruffy and seemed to be on drugs, judging by his eyes. He claimed he could hear the phone ringing and beckoned me to come through a gap in the fence to help search. The first guy kept insisting, "It's ringing, right?" And I said it was, though I hadn't even dialed the last digits. Now I was sure they were trying to lure me to their side of the fence. After repeatedly urging me to help, I heard the larger guy mutter, "He's not going to fall for it." Though he said it quietly, I clearly heard him in the stillness of the deserted area. The first guy started acting aggressively, punching a tree and ranting about how badly he needed his phone, saying his whole life was on it. Meanwhile, the larger guy had moved a few steps away, and I couldn't keep both in view at once. By this time, it was after 5 p.m., and the sudden darkness made the situation even more unsettling. I noticed a gap in the fence where the larger man was heading and decided it was time to get out of there. I ran without looking back at first. Neither of them said anything as I bolted, which made me certain their intentions were bad. But they stayed silent. After sprinting for about 20 to 30 seconds, I glanced back to see if they were following me. They weren't, they just stood there, watching me. I kept running and didn't stop looking back until I was out of sight. Eventually, I made it off the canal path and onto the roads. When I reported the incident, the person I spoke to took my details and the descriptions of the men but didn't seem to think it was serious. They assured me it would be investigated. Even so, the whole experience left me shaken, and I doubt I'll be jogging that route alone anytime soon. If you enjoy Halloween stories, stick around. I will be sharing only Halloween stories until the end of October. And if you have made it this far, hit the likes and share the video. Story 2. He wanted alone time with me. When I was around 15, I met Dave, a guy who would become one of my closest friends. Dave and I had mutual friends, so we often hung out. At the time, Dave wasn't out yet, so deeply closeted he could have found Narnia. A year later, at 16, I went to a Halloween party where Dave introduced me to Alan, who would later become my long-term boyfriend. Alan and Dave had been best friends since high school, and Alan knew Dave was gay from the start, while I had figured it out from seeing Dave's porn collection. Still, Dave didn't come out until Alan and I had been dating for over a year. We were all happy that he finally felt comfortable being himself. Shortly after coming out, Dave met his first boyfriend, which is where the story begins. Dave met Jimmy, a guy a few years older than us, on a camping trip. At the time, Dave and Alan were 20, I was 18, and Jimmy was around 25. This story took place in the summer of 2020. Dave and Jimmy had been dating for about 2 weeks when I first met him. Dave brought Jimmy to my parents' condo to pick me up for lunch. I wasn't ready, so they came upstairs while I finished my makeup. Lunch went well, and Jimmy seemed nice enough. Dave dropped me off after lunch, and I spent the evening relaxing. A couple of hours later, my mom came in, asking if I knew someone named Jimmy, who was at the front door asking for me. Apparently, Dave had dropped Jimmy at a nearby library, and he decided to come over to hang out since he got bored. My mom let him in, and Jimmy made himself comfortable on my bed, casually talking to me, while I grew annoyed because I had plans to relax. I texted Dave to come get him, and about 45 minutes later, Dave showed up. Before leaving, Jimmy asked for my phone number, and I gave it to him. The next few days were uneventful until Jimmy messaged me, saying he thought I was cool and wanted to hang out, just the two of us. He sent something like, "I'd prefer to hang out alone sometime so we can get to know each other better," smiley face. Red flags started going off. Jimmy grew pushy, and after telling a friend about it, she helped me send random messages to him from my phone to get him to back off, which worked for a while. At some point, Jimmy lost his place to live and ended up moving in with Alan and his roommate. Dave still lived at home and hadn't come out to his parents, so Jimmy couldn't stay with him. Alan's apartment was small, but they managed to fit a second mattress on the floor of Alan's room, where Jimmy slept. Dave was constantly over, so all three of them were sharing the space. Jimmy was a terrible roommate, never cleaning up, never contributing, and relying on Dave for rides everywhere. Alan and I tolerated it for Dave's sake because he was in love with Jimmy, but things got worse. Even after the text incident, Jimmy kept trying to talk to me, flirting and giving overly long hugs. He'd make comments like, "Are you happy with Alan?" He seems like a bit of an asshole, which made me uncomfortable. Alan and I weren't big on PDA, but that didn't mean he treated me badly. Still, I brushed off Jimmy's behavior until one night when things escalated. It was around Halloween. Alan and his roommates threw a small party, just a handful of close friends. Alan and I had finally gotten some alone time, we had a few beers and afterward, I was tired and took a nap in his bed. So I put on a tank top and my underwear and curled up under the blankets. I swear I had locked the door, but at some point, Jimmy came in while I was asleep, lifted the blankets, and crawled into bed with me. I woke up to Alan shouting, "What the flippin' are you doing?" It wasn't Alan next to me, it was Jimmy, shirtless and spooning me while I was asleep. Alan was furious, but Jimmy insisted it was harmless. Mortified, I showed Alan the texts Jimmy had sent me. Alan told Dave, but Dave refused to believe Jimmy would do something like that. Afterward, Jimmy continued texting me, saying he was sorry if I misunderstood his actions, and something like, "You remind me of someone, like a girlfriend from a past life. I just want to be closer to you." That was the final straw. Jimmy got kicked out of the apartment, and Dave was angry at us. Though he eventually apologized a month later after breaking up with Jimmy. To this day, Dave only refers to Jimmy as a piece of shit. Alan and I are still together, and we remain close to Dave, even attending family functions with him. Dave came out to his parents, moved on, and has been with a wonderful boyfriend for 4 years. And thankfully, this one has never tried to spoon me. I hadn't thought about Jimmy in years until last year when I saw him working in the sporting goods section at Walmart. My dad and I were checking the price of ammo, and Jimmy was the one helping us. He tried to make eye contact, but I ignored him. Afterward, my dad mentioned that the guy had been staring at me, and I just called him a creep and left it at that. I've never been more relieved to leave a Walmart. Story 3. I think I created a monster. About 15 years ago, when I was around 22, my best friend and I would go out to bars 3 to 4 nights a week. We met interesting people and made new friends, especially at a few regular spots, including one bar where we knew the bartender and manager well. During Halloween month, the staff dressed up in different costumes each night, and that's when we met Ron. He was a bouncer at the bar, but when I handed him my ID, he didn't catch my eye at all. I never really looked people in the face back then. My friend and I hung out, drank, danced, and then chatted with our bartender friend. He asked what I thought of Ron, but I didn't even know who he was talking about until he gestured toward the bouncer. My response was meh. Ron was older, very muscular, apparently a gym rat, and not my type. I was all about black clothes, skulls, and platforms back then. But our bartender friend vouched for him, saying Ron was a cool guy, and asked if he could give him my number. I figured it wouldn't hurt. The next day, Ron texted me, wanting to hang out. I was living with my uncle and aunt, a pastor and his wife, so he suggested we meet at his place for a casual daytime hangout. When I got there, his apartment door was wide open, and his married best friend, who was closer to my age, was there. I didn't feel unsafe since the door was open, and our bartender friend had vouched for him. Ron said he needed some office supplies, so the three of us hopped into his flashy car and went to an office supply store. As we walked in, a pretty girl passed by, and Ron did the obvious head turning, staring at her. I found it rude, so later in the car, I told him, "Look, I know we're just hanging out, but don't disrespect me like that. Everyone looks, but don't make me look like an idiot in public." He laughed and said it was hot that I stood up for myself, especially on our first hangout. Okay then. Back at his place, as we walked in, Ron said, "You're going to have a ring on your finger by December." Keep in mind, we had just met during Halloween week. His friend left, and Ron and I got takeout, drank, and talked. It turned out we were from the same small town, 6 hours south, and he was a Desert Storm veteran, more than 20 years older than me. He worked full-time, was back in school, and bounced at the bar on weekends. He seemed decent. He asked about my tattoos. I have a lot, and we talked about my love for horror and true crime. He didn't know much about it, so I offered to lend him my encyclopedia of serial killers as a crash course. A week later, I brought him the book when we hung out again. We saw each other multiple times, and I even spent the night at his place a few times. One day, we were hanging out and day drinking heavily when Ron said something that made me feel like he was getting too comfortable, telling me what to do. I told him not to talk to me like that and turned to leave. Suddenly, he grabbed my hair at the base of my neck. I grabbed his hand, and he tried to laugh it off, apologizing and saying he didn't mean to be rough, acting like it was some kind of foreplay. I shut that down quickly. I wanted to leave, but I was too buzzed, so I decided to wait it out while he worked on something. As I sat there, he started talking in graphic detail about his favorite serial killer from the book. Something about the way he was talking felt off, but I was still waiting for the buzz to wear off. He then began working on a sociology assignment, playing videos about urban legends with creepy content that started to freak me out. I asked him to wait until I left to play them or to put on headphones, and he laughed, calling me a poser. "You have all these tattoos and skulls, but you're really scared. You look all goth or punk rock, but you're terrified." He was really enjoying my discomfort. Then, his face got serious, and he told me he had a machete under his mattress. I looked and saw the handle sticking out. He said he could make me disappear, and no one would ever find my body. In that moment, my adrenaline kicked in. I grabbed my bag, ran to my car, and drove off. He slowly followed, laughing and telling me not to leave. I parked down the road, near the mall, to calm down and called my friend to unload everything. Over the next week, Ron bombarded me with texts and calls, alternating between begging for another chance and calling me a poser. I told our bartender friend, and he was shocked. Ron only worked a few more shifts at the bar before moving on to another girl in her early 20s, whose family owned a Vietnamese restaurant next door. I asked our bartender friend to warn her or give her my number, but he never saw her again. I hope she didn't get stuck with Ron. Every time I'm in that area, I pray I don't run into him. He can keep the encyclopedia, I just hope he hasn't picked up any tips from it. If you made it to the end, consider subscribing and hit the notification bell for more Halloween, and have a gentle day. Subscribe.